Welcome to the deep dive. We're jumping into a fascinating and, frankly, pretty challenging piece of philosophy today. This isn't exactly a gentle stroll. It's more of a deep, sometimes, quite combative critique of Immanuel Kant's huge body of work. It's written by another philosopher with some really strong ideas about, well, where everyone else went wrong.
That's right. The source material we're looking at is packed with insight, but yeah, also with some real intellectual fireworks. It's kind of like watching one philosophical giant take a swing at the reigning champion. So our goal in this deep dive is to navigate this dense text, try to pull out the core arguments, figure out what makes this author tick, really, and maybe uncover the surprising insights he offers about knowledge, reality, and, even ourselves.
Okay, let's dive in then. This author, he really doesn't pull any punches, does he? Right from the start, he gives this pretty dramatic take on the philosophical world after Kant. He basically argues that many just didn't grapple honestly with Kant's revolutionary ideas.
Exactly. He uses this really striking comparison, saying they were like alchemists after the birth of chemistry, still trying to do philosophy the old way, talking about God and the soul based on dogma, kind of ignoring Kant's powerful critiques of pure reason. He respects Kant's genius, definitely. Says his works will forever praise their author, but he feels the spirit of Kant's revolution just wasn't carried forward.
Right. And he quotes Goethe here with that vivid image about water closing in behind a ship.
Yeah, as the water that is displaced by a ship immediately flows in again behind it, the idea is that even when great minds push error aside, it just rushes back in. It's powerful.
It really is. A way of saying that despite Kant clearing the path, error just flooded right back.
And this author sees that whole philosophical period right after Kant as just like a brief episode when he thinks is now ending.
Which leads him to make this really remarkable claim. He argues that nothing truly significant happened in philosophy between Kant and himself. He sees himself quite boldly as Kant's direct, immediate successor.
It's an incredible assertion. I mean, really. He credits Kant, yes, and also the sacred writings of the Hindus and Plato as his main influences. But he's also super clear that to establish his own system, he has to be thoroughly polemical, argumentative, critical towards Kant. He needs to show exactly where he thinks Kant, missed the mark.
And this is where he drops his central kind of revolutionary idea, isn't it? The one that really flips traditional thinking on its head. He argues that the deepest part of us, the fundamental thing in itself, the underlying reality of ourselves and the world, it's not the intellect, not the mind or the soul, it's the will.
This is the absolute core departure. For centuries, philosophy tended to put the thinking, knowing mind at the center, right? The essence of humanity. But for our author, the intellect, our ability to know, perceive, be conscious, it's secondary. It's just a tool, an instrument created for the service of the will.
So kind of like our legs are tools for the will to move us around, or our stomach helps the will get nourishment. The brain and intellect are tools for the will to navigate the world.
Precisely that. And he offers several quite compelling examples from just everyday experience to show this primacy of the will. He notes, for instance, that our intellect can actually be mystified by the will's true motives. We often don't really know why we truly want something just by thinking about it. We only learn our own will by watching our actions and feelings over time.
That makes a lot of sense. You act on an impulse, and only later do you maybe figure out the real reason behind it.
Exactly. He also points out that character, our fundamental nature, is rooted in this unchangeable will. It stays with us our whole life. Meanwhile, the intellect, it changes, it ages, it can even decline. That suggests one is fundamental, the other is more functional, mutable.
And he links memory to the will, too. That's interesting.
Yeah, he suggests memory isn't just a brain function, but it's tied to that underlying will. He kind of muses that a being of pure intelligence without any will might not even have memory, because the will is like the thread that connects our experiences, gives them importance.
Okay. And he also highlights the will's tireless nature, comparing it to the heart, which he sees as a primary manifestation of will in the body. But knowledge, intellect, needs rest. We need sleep.
Right, which again points to the intellect being secondary, a function that needs downtime, unlike the ever-present will. And here's where it gets, really interesting and maybe a bit dark. He even looks at suicide. He doesn't see it as an act of free will in the usual sense, but as an act of the intellect deciding against the deep underlying will to live, which he views as this fundamental drive in all living things. So for him, even this extreme act actually demonstrates the will's deeper, more primary nature compared to the intellect's sort of derived power.
Wow. Okay. So Really understanding this author starts with getting this fundamental reorientation. The will is the engine, the intellect is more like the dashboard or the steering wheel.
That's a great way to put it. That's it, exactly. Now, let's see how this whole perspective shapes his view on the nature of knowledge itself. He argues that perception, direct, intuitive knowledge through our senses is the source and the only unconditionally true, genuine knowledge.
Meaning what we directly see, hear, feel, touch.
Yeah.
That's the bedrock of all knowing.
Yes. Abstract concepts, the ideas we form in our heads, the words we use, they're derived from these perceptions through abstraction. But, and this is absolutely crucial for him, these abstract concepts must be traceable back to specific perceptions or examples to have any real content, real meaning.
Okay. So if you can't point to something concrete that an abstract idea refers back to, it's basically just hot air. Meaningless.
Precisely. He calls concepts that can't be grounded in perception mere words or juggling with words. And this leads him to his really strong critique of purely abstract, disconnected thinking. He thinks it leads to error and what he calls philosophical charlatanism. He's particularly hard on figures like Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel here, accusing them of, empty speculation, trying to build philosophical systems out of thin air.
So for us, listening and trying to understand complex topics, this is a pretty vital takeaway, isn't it? Always ask, can I ground this abstract idea in something I can actually perceive or point to?
Absolutely. It's like a built-in BS detector, you could say. Against jargon or concepts that sound profound but maybe lack real substance.
Okay, now that we've got his core ideas, the primacy of will, the foundation, perception, let's see how he uses this lens to critique Kant's system directly.
Yeah, this is where he really gets into the weeds with Kant, but always, from his own specific viewpoint. He basically argues that Kant, brilliant as he was, fundamentally misunderstood the deepest reality, which for him is the will, and therefore parts of Kant's system were built on, flawed foundations.
Let's start with Kant's categories and that chapter on schematism. Kant was trying to show how our minds structure raw sense data using these built-in mental structures, right? Like causality, substance. Our author takes issue with this.
He does. He finds Kant's explanation of how these abstract categories actually connect to our raw sensations. That's the schematism bit. He finds it exceedingly obscure. He thinks Kant's deduction of the categories themselves is kind of forced, and the whole section is just tangled and contradictory. He suspects Kant was sometimes maybe driven more by a love of philosophical neatness, symmetry in his system, rather than just following the truth wherever it led.
Interesting. What about Kant's famous antinomies? Where pure reason seems to hit these unavoidable contradictions, like, is the universe finite or infinite? Freedom or necessity?
Our author basically dismisses the antinomies as a mere delusion, a sham fight. It's quite dismissive. He argues that one side of the contradiction, the antithesis, like the infinity of space that does rest on the necessary way, our minds structure reality through knowledge, like the forms of space and time. But the other side, the thesis, like the world having a beginning, he sees that as having subjective roots, or based on flawed assumptions, sometimes even just the laziness of the speculating individual, a bit harsh. He thinks Kant didn't quite see the true source of why reason seems to contradict itself there.
Okay, and Kant's deduction of the ideas of reason, soul, world, God, which Kant linked to different forms of logical syllogisms.
Yeah, our author finds that connection completely forced. Again, he thinks it's just Kant's love of symmetry, not actual logical necessity. He argues you can't just deduce fundamental ideas about reality like the soul or God from abstract logical forms. It doesn't work. He calls it a violent birth. And he views a lot of the philosophical talk about the absolute that came after Kant as just trying to sneak the old idea of a necessary being, the cosmological proof for God, back into philosophy after Kant seemed to have dismantled it.
He's definitely not a fan of abstract systems that lose touch with reality. So what about Kantian ethics? The categorical imperative act only on principles you could make universal laws.
Ooh, he has some of his strongest criticisms here. He really goes after it. He argues that Kant's famous moral principle, while it seems pure and rational, is actually based on a subtle kind of rational egoism. The whole idea of universalizing your action, he suggests, is ultimately motivated by a calculation of what would be best for you if everyone followed that rule. It's self-interest dressed up.
Right, and he famously critiques Kant's idea that a truly moral act has to be done only out of respect for duty, and not from feelings like compassion or benevolence.
Exactly. He finds that idea pedantic, just completely missing the point. He argues it's worthless as a basis for genuine ethics. He even notes how the poet Schiller satirized this aspect of Kant's system. For our author, real morality stems from something deeper than abstract duty. It comes from fellow feeling, from compassion, which Kant seemed to distrust as proper motivation. He thinks character and the will are basically fixed, so searching for some principle that could magically transform character is like, well, searching for the alchemist's stone. Pointless.
It's fascinating how he just consistently brings everything back to his core idea.
Yeah.
The will is fundamental. Okay, let's shift gears slightly from his critiques to some of the deeper insights he offers into human nature through his system. One surprising one is his theory of laughter.
Ah, yes. It's actually a great illustration of his ideas in action. He defines laughter as the sudden realization of an incongruity, a mismatch between an abstract concept we have in our head and an actual perceived object or situation.
So the humor comes from when reality suddenly doesn't fit the mental box we've put it in.
Precisely. It requires both reason to form the concept or expectation and perception to see the unexpected thing that doesn't fit. And he says it's a mark of being human, distinguishing us from animals like dogs who can't laugh because they lack abstract reason. He gives examples like, seeing a very formal, pompous person suddenly slip on a banana peel. The abstract concept of dignified person crashes against the perception of their silly, undignified fall. That clash is funny.
That makes sense. He also talks quite a bit about the limitations and imperfections of the intellect, doesn't he?
Yes, absolutely. Because for him, the intellect is just a tool developed for the individual will's survival and goals. It's inherently limited and biased. It's not pure reason. It's easily influenced by the will's desires, fears, needs. He quotes that Latin proverb, vexatio intellectum, meaning trouble or suffering sharpens the intellect, suggesting our understanding is often clearest not when we're calm, but when our will is intensely engaged by danger or need. And he notes the intellect, tied to the brain, ages and weakens, while the will itself persists.
And he's quite direct about inherent differences in people's mental capacity, too.
Oh, very direct. He talks about innate differences in the quality of thought, everything from the breadth of someone's perspective to the speed and clarity of their understanding. He observes how, mediocre minds often struggle with or even resent truly superior ones. He quotes thinkers like Hobbes and Lichtenberg on this. People often feel better about themselves around those less capable, apparently, and there can be an almost instinctive avoidance of sharp, quick intellects by those with less mental firepower.
But he makes a distinction between this sort of intellect or understanding and something deeper. True wisdom or genius.
Yes, this is key. For him, wisdom and genius aren't just about piling up abstract knowledge or book learning. Not at all. They stem from a profound depth and sharpness of perceptive apprehension, an ability to see the world, its connections, its essence, directly and intuitively. He says the wise man lives in a different world from the fool, precisely because he sees it differently. Book learning is secondary, abstract. Genius is about this direct, intuitive grasp of reality, like Cervantes writing Don Quixote in presence of the perception of life itself.
He also draws a line between philosophy and religion, connecting back to that idea of truth versus allegory.
Right. For him, philosophy's job is to seek strict, unvarnished truth about the world, based on reasoned conviction. No compromises. Religion, on the other hand, offers allegorical truth stories, symbols, myths, mainly for the masses. It often contains mysteries and contradictions because, he argues, the full, naked truth is just too challenging for most people to handle directly. So he believes philosophy must focus squarely on the world as it is and leave the gods in peace, meaning it should stay secular and grounded in experience. And he notably points to Buddhism as a major world religion that is, in essence, atheistic, focused on understanding suffering and achieving liberation within this world.
Okay, let's loop back quickly to one of Kant's most important concepts and how our author reinterprets it, that distinction between the phenomenon and the thing in itself.
Yes, he absolutely agrees with Kant's crucial insight there. The world, as it appears to us, conditioned by our mind structures like space, time, causality, that is the phenomenon, the world as idea. He accepts that this world we experience is, in a fundamental sense, an ideal construction of our minds based on sensory input.
But where Kant said, the thing in itself, the reality existing independently of our minds, is ultimately unknowable.
This is where our author makes his boldest move. He says, no, we can know what it is, or at least identify it. He identifies that unknowable thing in itself as the will. So for him, the fundamental independent reality underlying the world of appearances isn't some abstract, inscrutable substance. It's active, striving will.
And because our knowledge is structured by those subjective forms, like causality, we can only ever fully grasp the phenomenon, the world as appearance, not the will directly.
Exactly. And this, for him, explains why there's always something elusive, something fundamentally hidden or inscrutable about everything in the world. Even in self-consciousness, he argues, we don't grasp our thing in itself, our own will, directly and completely. Our self-knowledge is also mediated. It involves the intellect observing the actions and feelings prompted by the will. There's always a gap between our deepest being, the will, and our intellectual understanding of it.
He briefly touches on the senses too, fitting them into this picture.
Yeah, he sees the senses basically as channels bringing raw material sensations to the brain. Then the intellect, using its built-in forms like causality, works them up into the perceptions that make up the phenomenal world, the world as idea. And he makes an interesting distinction between senses that primarily give objective knowledge, like sight and touch, and those that seem to affect the will more directly, like smell and taste.
Right, and he has that curious observation about sound being particularly disturbing to an active mind.
Yes, it's quite specific. He suggests, quoting Lichtenberg, I think, that the amount of noise someone can tolerate without being disturbed is inversely proportional to their intellectual capacity. He sees unnecessary noise almost as a sign of a lack of thought or sensitivity, as if the sound itself disrupts the internal work of the intellect. Thinking about, the noise levels in the modern world, that's certainly a provocative thought.
Definitely something to think about. So to quickly recap this author's core ideas then,
Yeah.
we start with that revolutionary claim, the primacy of the will over the intellect.
Yep.
This shapes his view that perception, direct experience, is the true foundation of knowledge. Abstract concepts come later and must be grounded in perception.
Right.
He then uses this unique perspective to launch these really pointed critiques of Kantian philosophy, arguing Kant missed the true nature of reality, the will, and so built parts of his system on, well, shaky ground.
Flawed foundations, yeah.
And finally, his own system offers these fascinating, sometimes really surprising insights into human nature, things like laughter, the limits of our intellect, the nature of genius.
It's definitely a cohesive system, though often challenging, absolutely, built on this radical shift away from intellect-first thinking towards will-first thinking.
It's certainly a philosophy that forces you to reconsider some pretty fundamental assumptions. This intense focus on the will as the fundamental reality, with the intellect just as its tool. It really offers a very different lens to view ourselves through.
It really does. It shifts the weight, doesn't it? From what we think to what drives us, from knowledge being primary to willing being primary.
And that leaves us with this question for you, the listener, to maybe consider as you go about your day. Given this perspective, where the will is the fundamental reality and the intellect is just its function, how might your understanding of your own decisions and motivations change? Does focusing on why you will things perhaps matter more ultimately than focusing only on what you think about them?